On August 14, 1978, in an isolated cabin 73 kilometers outside Portland, Oregon, a man named Joe Alexander Sr. made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He looked at the young woman handcuffed to a radiator in the corner of the room, her head shaved, her saffron robes torn from 3 days of struggling, her eyes still glazed with the particular emptiness that comes from 18 months of chanting 16 hours a day, and he understood with perfect clarity that this deprogramming was going to take longer than any case he'd ever handled before. 8 people were involved in the kidnapping. The deprogrammer was Joe Alexander Sr., 47 years old, 230 pounds of former Marine, who'd deprogrammed 63 people in the previous 4 years. The cult was the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, known to most Americans simply as the Hare Krishnas. The family member trapped inside the programming was Rebecca Anne Whitmore, 23 years old, who 18 months earlier had been a nursing student at Oregon State University and was now convinced she was a reincarnated soul servant of Lord Krishna, destined to chant her way to eternal liberation. The Portland Police Department would later call it one of the most violent deprogramming attempts in Oregon history. But the reason behind the 8-day ordeal wasn't religion, wasn't even the family's desperation to save their daughter from what they saw as brainwashing, wasn't even Joe Alexander's growing reputation as the second most successful deprogrammer in America after Ted Patrick. It was something darker. It was the moment when everyone involved realized that sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, no matter how many techniques you use, no matter how much you love someone, the programming goes too deep, and the choice becomes whether to keep fighting past the point of ethics, past the point of legality, past the point of basic human decency, or to admit defeat and let someone you love disappear into a world you can't follow them into. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme psychological manipulation, physical restraint, family trauma, religious deprogramming techniques that crossed into torture, and a conclusion that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about rescue, rights, and the cost of trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Portland, Oregon occupied 376 square kilometers of the Willamette Valley in 1978, with a population of 368,000 people living in a city that prided itself on being weird, progressive, and just counterculture enough to attract every alternative religious movement on the West Coast. The city sat at the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia rivers, surrounded by forests that turned the air thick with the smell of Douglas fir and western red cedar. In August, temperatures climbed to 27 degrees Celsius during the day, dropping to 15 at night when fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, 120 kilometers to the west. Portland in 1978 was a city caught between identities. The hippie movement of the 60s had evolved into something stranger, more fragmented. Communes still existed in the forests outside the city limits, but they'd been joined by religious ashrams, meditation centers, and experimental communities that blended Eastern philosophy with Western capitalism in ways that made traditional religious leaders deeply uncomfortable. Downtown Portland smelled like coffee from the roasters that had started appearing on every corner, marijuana smoke that drifted from Powell's books where students gathered, and patchouli oil that seemed to be the official scent of anyone under 30 who'd rejected their parents' Presbyterian worldview. But 1978 was also the year everything started to darken. The Jonestown massacre would happen in November, just 3 months after Rebecca Whitmore's deprogramming. 909 people would die in the Guyanese jungle, and suddenly, America's tolerance for alternative religions would evaporate overnight. The word cult would shift from academic terminology to a synonym for danger, manipulation, and death. The Hare Krishna movement had established its Pacific Northwest headquarters in a converted warehouse in southeast Portland in 1975. The building occupied an entire city block on Southeast Morrison Street, painted in colors that the neighborhood association had complained about but couldn't legally prevent. Bright orange, yellow, saffron, colors that announced from 3 blocks away that this was not a normal building. Inside, 73 devotees lived in conditions that would have violated every building code in Portland if city inspectors had been allowed inside, which they weren't. Mattresses on floors. One bathroom per 20 people. A kitchen that prepared meals for everyone. Vegetarian food cooked in massive pots. The same dal and rice every day because variety was considered a material attachment. The temple room took up the entire third floor. Statues of Krishna, Radha and other deities arranged on an altar that devotees had spent 6 months constructing, incense burning constantly, sandalwood and jasmine, thick enough to make your eyes water if you weren't used to it. And the chanting, always the chanting, 16 rounds of the Hare Krishna mantra per day minimum, 108 repetitions per round, voices blending into a sound that was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling to anyone who heard it from the street below. The Hare Krishnas recruited primarily from college campuses and downtown areas where young people gathered. Their technique was sophisticated, refined over years of practice. Devotees would approach individuals who looked lost, searching, spiritually hungry, would offer free vegetarian meals, philosophy discussions, a sense of community and purpose. What they didn't mention until later was the sleep deprivation, 4 hours per night maximum because sleep was considered laziness. The diet restrictions that left people malnourished and foggy. The constant chanting that created a meditative state that made critical thinking nearly impossible. The surrender of all possessions, all money, all connection to family and friends who might question what was happening. By 1978, an estimated 5,000 Americans had joined ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Most were between 18 and 25 years old. Most came from middle-class families. Most had been searching for meaning in a world that felt increasingly meaningless after Vietnam, after Watergate, after the death of the 60s dream. And most families had no idea what to do when their children disappeared into orange robes and started speaking in Sanskrit mantras instead of English sentences. Rebecca Anne Whitmore was 23 years old in February 1977, the month she first encountered the Hare Krishnas on the campus of Oregon State University in Corvallis. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, 132 pounds, with dark brown hair that fell to the middle of her back and grey eyes that her mother always said looked like storm clouds over the Pacific. On her left shoulder, a scar shaped like a crescent moon, legacy of a bicycle accident when she was 9 years old. She'd crashed into a parked car while racing her older brother David down their street, went over the handlebars, and landed on a piece of broken glass that required 14 stitches to close. Every morning, Rebecca woke at 6:30 in her dorm room at Oregon State, made instant coffee in an electric kettle she'd bought at Goodwill for $3, sat at her desk reviewing nursing textbooks, biochemistry and anatomy and pharmacology, subjects that made sense in a world that increasingly didn't. She was in her second year of nursing school, carrying a 3.7 grade point average, on track to graduate in 1979, and start working at Portland General Hospital, where she'd already been accepted into their nursing residency program. Rebecca's family was solidly middle class. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, 51 years old, worked as an accountant for a lumber company in Portland. Her mother, Patricia Whitmore, 48, taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in the suburbs. Her older brother, David, 26, was finishing law school at the University of Oregon. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in the Eastmoreland neighborhood of Portland, mortgage halfway paid off, 2 cars that ran most of the time, a dog named Chester who was 14 years old and mostly blind, but still wagged his tail when anyone came home. What Rebecca valued most wasn't her grades or her future career, or even her family, though she loved them deeply. What she valued was certainty, the feeling that she understood how the world worked and what her place in it should be. She valued structure, plans, the ability to look 5 years into the future and see exactly where she'd be. But in February 1977, Rebecca Anne Whitmore didn't have certainty anymore. She had questions that kept her awake at night, existential weight that made her nursing textbooks feel absurd. What was the point of learning to heal bodies that would eventually die anyway? What was the purpose of a career, a house, a family, a life that would end and be forgotten within 2 generations? Her roommate had started dating a philosophy major who talked about Buddhist meditation and Hindu concepts of Maya, the illusion of material reality. Rebecca had listened to these conversations with growing fascination, started reading books about Eastern spirituality, stopped going to the Presbyterian church her parents had raised her in, because the sermons about Jesus loving everyone felt shallow compared to these new ideas about consciousness, reincarnation, liberation from the cycle of birth and death. On February 11, 1977, at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Rebecca was walking across the Oregon State campus when she encountered 3 people in orange robes singing and playing instruments near the Memorial Union building. They were beautiful. That was the first thing Rebecca would remember later. Not strange, not weird, not off-putting, beautiful. The woman playing the harmonium had a shaved head and a smile that seemed to radiate pure joy. The 2 men chanting had voices that harmonized perfectly, and the sound, the Hare Krishna mantra repeated in a melody that seemed to bypass her rational mind and speak directly to something deeper. Rebecca stopped to listen. One of the chanters, a young man maybe 25 years old with a shaved head and orange robes, smiled at her, continued chanting, but made eye contact that felt like he was seeing into her soul, recognizing something there that Rebecca herself hadn't fully acknowledged. When the chanting ended, the young man approached her. "Have you heard about Krishna consciousness?" His voice was gentle, educated, not the aggressive recruitment pitch Rebecca had expected. "A little," Rebecca said. "I have been reading about Hinduism." The young man's smile widened. His name was Radhanatha Devi, he would tell her later, though his birth name was Stephen Morrison, and he'd been a biochemistry student at UCLA before joining ISKCON 2 years earlier. "Hinduism is beautiful," Radhanatha Devi said, "but Krishna consciousness is the perfection of Vedic knowledge. It's not just philosophy, it's a science of self-realization. Would you like to come to our temple tonight? We serve free vegetarian dinner and have philosophy discussions. No pressure, just an opportunity to learn." Rebecca Anne Whitmore, 23 years old, nursing student, daughter of an accountant and a 3rd-grade teacher, made a decision in that moment that would alter the trajectory of her entire life. She said yes. The Portland Hare Krishna Temple served dinner every night at 6:30. On February 11, 1977, when Rebecca arrived, she counted 43 people sitting cross-legged on the floor of the temple room, eating from metal plates called thalis. The meal was called prasadam, food that had been offered to Krishna before being distributed to devotees and guests. Dal, rice, chapatis, a vegetable curry with cauliflower and potatoes, and a sweet called halava, made with cream of wheat and ghee. Rebecca sat next to a young woman named Radha Devi, born Lisa Chen, who'd been at the temple for 6 months. Lisa had kind eyes and spoke with genuine enthusiasm about how Krishna consciousness had solved all her problems, given her life meaning, shown her the path to eternal happiness. Around them, devotees chanted before eating, a prayer in Sanskrit that Rebecca didn't understand but found hypnotic. Then they ate in mostly silence, punctuated by occasional quiet conversations about scripture, service, devotion. After dinner, a philosophy class. A senior devotee named Bhakta Robert, 42 years old with a grey beard and eyes that seemed infinitely patient, sat on a raised platform and explained the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna's conversation with the warrior Arjuna about duty, detachment, and the eternal soul. Rebecca listened with growing fascination. These concepts addressed exactly the questions that had been troubling her. The meaninglessness of material existence, the reality of the soul beyond the body, the path to liberation from suffering through devotional service. The class lasted 90 minutes. Afterward, Radha Devi invited Rebecca to come back tomorrow, maybe come earlier, help prepare prasadam in the kitchen, experience the joy of devotional service. Rebecca returned the next day, and the day after that. And within a week, she was spending more time at the Krishna temple than at her dorm room. The technique the Hare Krishnas used on Rebecca Anne Whitmore was called love bombing, though nobody used that term in 1977. It was a systematic process of overwhelming a recruit with affection, acceptance, and belonging. Every time Rebecca entered the temple, devotees would smile at her, greet her by name, ask about her day with genuine interest, compliment her chanting, her service, her growing understanding of Krishna consciousness, make her feel like she was the most important person in the room. Compared to the isolation of dorm life, the competitive stress of nursing school, the complicated relationships with roommates and classmates who seemed superficial and materialistic, the Krishna temple felt like home. Within 2 weeks, Rebecca was chanting 4 rounds of the Hare Krishna mantra per day. Within 4 weeks, 8 rounds. By mid-March, she was chanting the full 16 rounds required of initiated devotees, which took approximately 2 hours per day of constant repetition. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. 108 repetitions per round, 16 rounds per day. 1,728 repetitions of the mantra every single day, creating a meditative state that neuroscientists would later discover had profound effects on brain chemistry, reducing activity in the prefrontal cortex responsible for critical thinking and increasing activity in areas associated with emotional experience and pattern recognition. But in March 1977, Rebecca just knew that chanting made her feel peaceful, made the anxiety about her future disappear, made the world make sense in a way it hadn't since she was a child. On March 28, 1977, Rebecca Anne Whitmore made a decision that her family would discover 2 days later with absolute horror. She dropped out of Oregon State University, withdrew from all her classes, moved into the Portland Hare Krishna temple full-time, surrendered her possessions, her savings account with $3,200 accumulated from summer jobs, and her identity as Rebecca Whitmore. Her new name, given by the temple president in a small ceremony that Rebecca experienced as the most spiritually significant moment of her life, was Radhanatha Devi Dasi, servant of Radha, consort of Krishna. She shaved her head the same day, felt the clippers against her scalp, watched her dark brown hair fall to the floor, and cried not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of surrender, of finally letting go of the material identity that had caused so much suffering. Patricia Whitmore received a letter from her daughter on March 30, 1977. It was written on plain paper, in Rebecca's handwriting, but signed Radhanatha Devi Dasi. Dear Mom and Dad, I have found truth. I have found the purpose of life. I am now a devotee of Krishna, living in service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. I know you won't understand, but this is the most authentic I've ever felt. I've surrendered my material attachments and dedicated my life to spiritual realization. Please don't worry about me. I'm happy in a way I never was before. I'll contact you when I'm ready, but for now I need to focus on my spiritual development without the distraction of material family relationships. Your daughter in Krishna consciousness, Radhanatha Devi Dasi. Patricia Whitmore read the letter 3 times, hands shaking. Then she called her husband at work. Thomas came home immediately. They read the letter together. Then Patricia started crying, deep wrenching sobs that came from a place of pure parental terror. Their daughter was gone. Not physically dead, but spiritually kidnapped by an organization they knew nothing about, except what they'd seen on the news. Strange people chanting in airports asking for money, looking vacant and cult-like. Thomas Whitmore called Oregon State University that afternoon, confirmed that Rebecca had indeed withdrawn from all her classes, called her dorm room. A roommate answered and said Rebecca had moved out, left most of her possessions behind, taken only her clothes and some books. That night, Thomas and Patricia drove to Portland, found the Hare Krishna temple on Southeast Morrison Street. Knocked on the door. A devotee answered, a young man with a shaved head who listened politely as Thomas explained that he was looking for his daughter Rebecca. We don't know anyone named Rebecca, the devotee said. But if you're seeking Krishna consciousness, you're welcome to attend our evening program. She's here, I know she's here. I want to see my daughter. Everyone here is here voluntarily. If your daughter has chosen to dedicate her life to Lord Krishna, that's her spiritual decision. We can't force her to see people who might disturb her consciousness. Thomas Whitmore, 51 years old, accountant, man who'd never been in a physical fight in his adult life, pushed past the devotee and walked into the temple. "Rebecca!" he shouted. "Rebecca Whitmore!" 30 devotees looked at him with identical expressions of benign concern. None of them responded to the name Rebecca. Then from the back of the room, a young woman approached. Her head was shaved. She wore a saffron sari. She looked like his daughter, but thinner, paler, eyes different somehow. "Dad," she said quietly, "you shouldn't be here. Rebecca, we're taking you home. My name is Radhanatha Devi Dasi, and this is my home." Thomas Whitmore tried. For 45 minutes, he tried to reason with his daughter, told her she was throwing away her education, her future, her family, told her this organization was manipulating her, told her to please just come home, and they could talk about this rationally. Rebecca, now Radhanatha Devi Dasi, responded with calm, scripted phrases about Maya, material illusion, spiritual truth, the temporary nature of bodily relationships compared to the eternal soul's relationship with Krishna. Finally, the temple president intervened, a man in his 50s named Kirtana Das, who explained very politely but very firmly that Thomas needed to leave or they would call the police for trespassing. Thomas left, drove home with Patricia. They sat in their living room, looking at family photos of Rebecca as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman who just 6 months ago had been excited about becoming a nurse. "What do we do?" Patricia whispered. Thomas Whitmore had no answer. Not yet. For 6 months, Thomas and Patricia Whitmore tried every conventional method to reach their daughter. They visited the temple 14 times. Each visit, Rebecca refused to speak with them beyond a few minutes of polite but distant conversation. She looked progressively thinner, more ethereal, less like the daughter they remembered. They called the police, explained that their daughter had been brainwashed by a religious cult. The Portland police listened sympathetically but explained the legal reality. Rebecca was 23 years old, a legal adult. She'd joined the organization voluntarily. Unless there was evidence of physical abuse, illegal activity, or immediate danger, there was nothing law enforcement could do. Religious freedom was constitutionally protected. They contacted a lawyer. He explained that they had zero legal recourse. Their daughter had committed no crime. The Hare Krishnas had committed no crime. Deprogramming, he explained carefully, was a legally grey area that could result in kidnapping charges if things went wrong. They tried talking to their Presbyterian pastor, Reverend Michael Thompson, who'd known Rebecca since she was 8 years old. Reverend Thompson visited the Krishna temple, tried to engage Rebecca in theological discussion, left after 90 minutes of circular conversation about the nature of God, and gave Thomas the devastating news that Rebecca seemed genuinely convinced, not coerced. Patricia Whitmore developed insomnia, would lie awake imagining her daughter in that warehouse, chanting 16 hours a day, eating insufficient food, surrendering everything that made her Rebecca. Thomas developed a drinking problem. Every night after work, 3, 4, sometimes 5 glasses of whiskey, trying to numb the helplessness, the rage at a system that protected his daughter's right to destroy her own life, but gave him no rights as a parent to intervene. Their son David, finishing law school, researched cults obsessively, read everything about the Hare Krishnas, about brainwashing techniques, about exit counseling and deprogramming. He was the one who first suggested what would become the most controversial decision the Whitmore family ever made. "There are people who specialize in getting cult members out," David told his parents in September 1977. "They're called deprogrammers. They kidnap the person, usually with family help, take them somewhere isolated and spend days breaking down the psychological programming through intensive intervention." "That's illegal," Thomas said. "So is what the Krishnas did to Rebecca," David countered. "They just did it legally." "I don't know," Patricia said. "Kidnapping our own daughter?" "She's been kidnapped already," David insisted. "We'd be rescuing her." The conversation continued for weeks. Thomas researched deprogrammers, found articles about Ted Patrick, the most famous but also the most legally controversial, found information about Joe Alexander Sr., a former Marine who'd learned deprogramming techniques from Patrick and had started his own practice in Seattle. In October 1977, Thomas Whitmore called Joe Alexander Sr. and explained the situation with his daughter. Joe Alexander Sr. was 46 years old in 1977, a year before Rebecca Whitmore's deprogramming would test everything he believed about his work. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, 230 pounds, with the build of someone who'd stayed military fit despite being out of the Marines for 20 years. His hair had gone completely grey by 40, which made him look older than he was, but his eyes were sharp, assessing, the eyes of someone who'd spent 2 tours in Vietnam learning to read people's intentions in microseconds. Joe had a scar that ran from his right ear down his jawline to his chin, legacy of a bar fight in 1959, when he was 25 and freshly back from his first tour. Someone had come at him with a broken bottle. Joe had won the fight, but carried the reminder forever. Every morning Joe woke at 5 in the morning, military time habit he'd never broken, made coffee in a French press, strong and black, did 100 push-ups, 50 pull-ups, ran 5 kilometers regardless of weather. Then showered, dressed, and began whatever deprogramming case he was currently working. Joe Alexander had deprogrammed 63 people between 1974 and 1977. He'd learned the technique from Ted Patrick directly, spent 2 weeks in 1974 observing Patrick's methods, then started taking cases on his own. His success rate was approximately 74%, slightly higher than Patrick's, primarily because Joe was more selective about which cases he took. He refused to deprogram anyone over 30, refused cases where the cult member had been in the organization for more than 3 years, refused cases where the family seemed more interested in control than in genuine rescue. What Joe valued most wasn't the money, though he charged between $8,000 and $15,000 per deprogramming, depending on complexity and family ability to pay. What he valued was the moment when someone's eyes cleared, when the programming broke, and they remembered who they were before the cult got hold of them. That moment made everything else, the legal risk, the violence, the psychological toll, worth it. When Thomas Whitmore called in October 1977, Joe listened to the case details carefully. Rebecca, now Radhanatha Devi Dasi, had been with the Hare Krishnas for 7 months. She was 23 years old. She'd been a nursing student with strong family ties before recruitment. She'd surrendered significant assets and cut contact with family, but hadn't been in the organization long enough for the programming to become permanent. It was, Joe assessed, a viable case, difficult but viable. He quoted Thomas $15,000, $10,000 up front, $5,000 upon successful completion. If the deprogramming failed, the Whitmores would still owe the full amount because Joe's time and risk were the same regardless of outcome. Thomas and Patricia Whitmore had $19,000 in savings. The $15,000 would wipe out most of it, but they didn't hesitate. Yes, Thomas said, whatever it takes. Joe Alexander Sr. spent 3 weeks planning Rebecca Whitmore's extraction before making his move. He surveilled the Portland Krishna temple, learned the patterns. Devotees left twice daily for Sankirtan, public chanting and solicitation. Morning group at 7 in the morning, evening group at 5 in the afternoon. Rebecca was in the evening group, which complicated things because evening meant more witnesses, more potential for police intervention. But evening also meant Rebecca would be tired from a full day of temple service. Tired meant easier to control physically, less likely to fight effectively. Joe identified the extraction point. A corner 3 blocks from the temple where the Sankirtan group always waited for the bus to downtown Portland. Rebecca would be separated from the others by approximately 3 meters, positioned at the edge of the group because she was still relatively new and lower in the hierarchy. He rented a cabin 109 kilometers outside Portland near the town of Estacada in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The cabin was isolated, accessed by a dirt road that became impassable in winter, but in August 1978 was just rough enough to discourage casual visitors. No neighbors within 8 kilometers. Cell phone service didn't exist yet, and the nearest payphone was 16 kilometers away in Estacada. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, One bathroom, a kitchen, a main room with a fireplace. Joe removed everything that could be used as a weapon, locked the windows from the outside, removed the phone line, stocked the kitchen with enough food for 10 days. He recruited help. Thomas and David Whitmore would be involved, obviously, but Joe also brought 2 assistants, both former military like himself. Marcus Webb, 38, who deprogrammed 12 people under Joe's supervision, and Jennifer Oakes, 29, one of the only female deprogrammers in America in 1978, who specialized in female cult members and understood the specific psychological dynamics better than the men did. The plan was simple. On August 14, 1978, when Rebecca's Sankirtan group waited at the bus stop, Joe and Marcus would approach in a white panel van. David and Thomas would be inside the van already. They'd grab Rebecca, pull her into the van before anyone could react, and drive directly to the cabin. Jennifer would meet them there, having arrived earlier to prepare. Estimated time from extraction to arrival at cabin, 97 minutes. On the morning of August 14, 1978, Joe Alexander Sr. woke at 5 in the morning, same as every morning. But instead of his normal routine, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter. The letter was addressed to his wife Margaret, married 32 years, who'd stopped asking questions about his deprogramming work after the first few cases because the answers disturbed her too much. The letter said that if something went wrong today, if Joe ended up arrested or dead, Margaret should know that he believed in what he was doing, that the 63 people he'd brought out of cults were worth the risks, that Rebecca Whitmore deserved a chance to remember who she was before the Hare Krishnas convinced her she was someone else. Joe sealed the letter, left it on his desk. Then he drove to Portland to kidnap a young woman and spend 8 days trying to save her from herself. At 16 hours and 47 minutes on August 14, 1978, Rebecca Whitmore stood at a bus stop on Southeast Morrison Street, 3 blocks from the Krishna temple, singing the Hare Krishna mantra with 6 other devotees. She was thinner than she'd been 18 months ago. Her weight had dropped from 132 pounds to 108. Her shaved head had grown out slightly, a 1/4 inch of dark brown hair that made her look like a cancer patient. She wore a saffron sari, bare feet in sandals despite the concrete being warm enough to hurt if she stood still too long. Rebecca was tired. She'd woken at 3:30 that morning for Mangal Arati, the morning temple worship, had spent 6 hours preparing prasadam in the kitchen, had chanted her 16 rounds, had cleaned the temple bathrooms. Now she was going downtown for Sankirtan, where she'd spend the next 4 hours approaching strangers, asking if they wanted to hear about Krishna consciousness, selling incense and Krishna books for donations that would go to the temple. Her feet hurt. Her head ached from dehydration because she'd forgotten to drink water, and devotees were trained to view physical discomfort as purification. Her stomach was empty because the breakfast prasadam had been insufficient, and complaining about hunger was considered materialistic. But Rebecca, now Radhanatha Devi Dasi, felt spiritually fulfilled. The suffering of the body was temporary. The soul's journey toward Krishna was eternal. At 16 hours and 49 minutes, a white panel van pulled to the curb 15 meters from the bus stop. Rebecca noticed it peripherally, but paid no attention. Her consciousness was focused on the mantra, on maintaining the meditative state that made Sankirtan bearable. At 16 hours, 49 minutes and 37 seconds, 2 men exited the van. One was massive, 6 feet 2 inches tall, 230 pounds. Grey hair moving with the controlled aggression of someone who knew exactly what violence looked like. The other was smaller, 6 feet even, athletic, wearing jeans and a dark blue jacket. At 16 hours, 49 minutes and 42 seconds, Rebecca Anne Whitmore's life exploded into chaos. The larger man, Joe Alexander Sr., grabbed her left arm. The smaller man, Marcus Webb, grabbed her right. They lifted her off her feet. She screamed or started to scream, but Marcus's hand covered her mouth. The other Krishna devotees reacted in confusion. 2 of them stepped forward, shouting, "Hey, what are you doing? Let her go." David Whitmore, Rebecca's brother, stepped out of the van. He looked at the devotees with an expression that mixed guilt and determination. "She's my sister," David said. "We're taking her home." "You can't do this." One of the devotees, a young man named Govinda Das, lunged toward Joe. Joe released Rebecca's arm long enough to shove Govinda hard enough to send him sprawling onto the sidewalk. "Call the police!" another devotee screamed. But by then Rebecca was inside the van. The door slammed. Joe and Marcus climbed in. The van accelerated. Total time from initial grab to van departure, 17 seconds. Inside the van, Rebecca fought, kicked, screamed, bit at the hands holding her. Marcus pinned her arms. Joe secured her legs. Thomas Whitmore, her father, sat in the passenger seat not looking back because he couldn't bear to see his daughter like this. Rebecca's screaming was muffled by Marcus's hand, but her eyes were wide with terror and fury. She recognized her brother, recognized her father's profile, and the recognition made it worse, not better. This wasn't strangers kidnapping her, this was her own family. "Radha," Rebecca screamed when Marcus's hand slipped. That was her temple name, the name she'd heard every day for 18 months. "Radha, Govinda, help me!" But the van was already 4 blocks away, turning onto Interstate 84, heading east toward the mountains. The drive from Portland to the cabin near Estacada took 1 hour and 34 minutes. The first 40 minutes, Rebecca screamed constantly, kicked at the van's interior, called her family Satan, Maya, demons sent to test her faith. Joe Alexander had brought a medical restraint system, essentially padded handcuffs connected to a waist belt. At 17 hours and 23 minutes, when Rebecca's struggling became dangerous, Joe secured her in the restraints. "She's going to hurt herself," Joe said to Thomas, who still wasn't looking back. "Just get her there," Thomas whispered. By 18 hours and 15 minutes, Rebecca had stopped screaming. Her voice was raw. She sat in the back of the van between Marcus and David, restrained, crying silently, chanting the Hare Krishna mantra under her breath. David tried to speak to her. "Rebecca, we're trying to help you. My name is Radhanatha Devi Dasi," Rebecca said. Her voice was hoarse but firm. "And you've just destroyed your karma for thousands of lifetimes." At 18 hours and 21 minutes, the van turned onto a dirt road that climbed into the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir pressed close on both sides. The temperature dropped 2 degrees for every 100 meters of elevation gain. At 18 hours and 42 minutes, they arrived at the cabin. Jennifer Oakes was waiting on the porch. She was 29 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, with short blonde hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd already deprogrammed 17 people and understood exactly what the next 8 days would entail. Jennifer had prepared the cabin's main bedroom, mattress on the floor, heavy curtains over the windows. A bucket in the corner for bathroom needs because allowing Rebecca access to the actual bathroom meant potential for escape or self-harm. Water bottles, granola bars, nothing else. Joe and Marcus carried Rebecca inside. She'd started screaming again when the van stopped, understanding that wherever they'd taken her was isolated enough that screaming wouldn't bring help. They placed her on the mattress. Joe removed the restraints, but Marcus and Jennifer stayed close, ready to respond if Rebecca tried to run. Thomas and David stood in the doorway. This was the moment Thomas had been dreading, the moment he had to look at his daughter and justify what he'd just done. "Rebecca," Thomas said. His voice broke. "We love you. We're doing this because we love you." "You've kidnapped me," Rebecca said. She wasn't crying anymore. Her eyes were dry, hard, the eyes of someone who'd moved past fear into pure hatred. "This is illegal, this is evil, and Krishna will punish you for it." Jennifer Oakes stepped forward, sat on the floor 2 meters from Rebecca, far enough to be non-threatening, close enough to respond if needed. "My name is Jennifer," she said. "I know you're scared and angry. That's normal. But I want you to know that everyone in this cabin cares about you. We're not here to hurt you. We're here to help you remember who you were before the Krishna temple." "I know exactly who I am," Rebecca said. "I'm Radhanatha Devi Dasi, servant of Krishna, and you people are demons." Jennifer nodded. "Okay, we'll start there then." The deprogramming of Rebecca Anne Whitmore began with silence. Jennifer Oakes had learned from experience that the first hours were about establishing that violence wouldn't work, escape wouldn't work, and the only path forward was conversation. Rebecca sat on the mattress, arms wrapped around her knees, chanting quietly, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare. Jennifer sat 2 meters away, said nothing, just maintained calm presence. Joe Alexander stood by the door. Marcus Webb sat in a chair by the window. Thomas and David had retreated to the cabin's second bedroom because seeing their family member like this was too painful. After 47 minutes of silence broken only by Rebecca's chanting, Jennifer spoke. "When did you first meet the Hare Krishnas?" Rebecca didn't respond, continued chanting. "Was it on campus?" Jennifer asked. "At Oregon State?" Still nothing. "Did they approach you or did you approach them?" Rebecca's chanting faltered for half a second. Jennifer noticed. "I'm guessing they approached you," Jennifer said. "That's usually how it works. They saw someone who looked like they were searching for something, someone intelligent, spiritual, open, and they offered you exactly what you needed." "You don't know anything about me," Rebecca said. First words in nearly an hour. Jennifer considered it progress. By 22 hours, 4 hours into the deprogramming, Rebecca had stopped chanting. The silence had become too heavy, too oppressive. She'd started responding to Jennifer's questions with short answers, mostly hostile but at least engaging. "How many hours a day do you chant?" Jennifer asked. 16 rounds, 2 hours. "How many hours do you sleep?" 4, maybe 5. "When did you last eat a full meal?" Rebecca's face flickered with something. Confusion, maybe. "This morning, prasadam." "What was it?" "Dal, rice, some vegetables. Were you still hungry after?" Silence. Then quietly, "Hunger is Maya." "Maya means illusion, right?" Jennifer said. "Material reality is illusion, spiritual reality is truth." "Yes." "And you learned that at the temple?" "Yes." "Before the temple, did you believe hunger was an illusion?" Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "You're trying to trick me." "I'm trying to understand your thinking," Jennifer said. "Help me understand. If you felt hungry before you joined the Krishnas, and you feel hungry now, but now you believe hunger is an illusion, what changed? The hunger or your interpretation of it?" "This is word games," Rebecca said. "Maybe," Jennifer agreed, "but words matter. The Krishnas use a lot of words to explain reality. I'm asking if those words match your actual experience." "My experience is spiritual," Rebecca said. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." At 2 in the morning on August 15th, 8 hours into the deprogramming, Rebecca was exhausted but couldn't sleep. The deprogramming team rotated shifts. Jennifer had been replaced by Joe Alexander, who sat in the chair by the window, watching Rebecca with the patient intensity of a predator. "Why did you join the Marines?" Rebecca asked suddenly. Joe raised an eyebrow. Didn't expect her to ask questions about him. "Believed in something bigger than myself," Joe said. "Wanted to serve." "Like me serving Krishna." "Similar," Joe said. "Except the Marines didn't require me to surrender my identity, starve myself, or cut contact with my family." "The Marines required you to kill people," Rebecca countered. Joe nodded. "True. And I carry that. Every person I killed in Vietnam, I remember their faces. The Marines gave me purpose but also gave me trauma. Took years to sort out what was service and what was manipulation." Rebecca was silent, processing. "You think the Krishnas are manipulating me?" she said. "I think they're using the same techniques the military uses," Joe said. "Sleep deprivation, controlled environment, repetitive training that bypasses critical thinking, surrender of individuality for group identity. Except the military does it to create soldiers. The Krishnas do it to create devotees who generate income. We don't generate income. We serve. You sell books and incense on the street for 12 hours a day," Joe said. "Where does that money go?" "To the temple, to support the devotees." "To support the leadership," Joe corrected. "The temple president, the regional coordinators, the people at the top. You're living on dal and rice, sleeping 4 hours a night." "Are they?" Rebecca's face tightened. "You're lying." "Am I? When's the last time you saw the temple president eat the same meal you ate?" By morning of the second day, 15 hours into the deprogramming, Rebecca had experienced her first physical breakdown. The combination of exhaustion, stress, and disruption of her daily chanting routine had left her shaking, nauseous, barely able to stand when Jennifer helped her to the bathroom. "I need to chant," Rebecca whispered. "Please, just let me chant my rounds." "You can chant," Jennifer said. "Nobody's stopping you." But Rebecca found she couldn't. In the cabin, separated from the temple environment, from the group reinforcement, the chanting felt hollow. The words came out but didn't create the meditative state she'd become dependent on. "This is torture," Rebecca said. "You're torturing me." "We're asking you to think," Jennifer said. "That's all. Think about your life before the temple. Think about what you wanted to become. Think about whether Radhanatha Devi Dasi is who you actually are or who you were programmed to be." One full day into the deprogramming, 24 hours since the kidnapping, Rebecca Anne Whitmore experienced her first memory breakthrough. David had replaced Jennifer on shift. He sat across from his sister, who looked more like a concentration camp survivor than the vibrant nursing student she'd been 2 years ago. "Remember when you were 16, David said, "and you wanted to be a veterinarian?" Rebecca looked at him with confusion. "I never wanted to be a veterinarian." "You did," David insisted. "For like 8 months. You volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. Came home covered in dog hair and cat scratches and told Mom and Dad you were going to open your own clinic." Rebecca's face did something complicated. A flicker of recognition, then resistance, then something that might have been grief. "I forgot about that," she whispered. "The Krishnas taught you to forget," David said. "Taught you that your past was Maya, illusion, not worth remembering. But that past is who you actually are. The girl who loved animals, who wanted to help things, who cried when our dog Chester got sick." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "How is Chester?" "He's old," David said. 14 now, mostly blind. But he still waits by the door every day like he's waiting for you to come home." The tears spilled over. Rebecca covered her face with her hands. "I can't think about that," she said. "It hurts too much." "Why does it hurt?" David asked gently. "Because I miss him." "I miss home, I miss—" Rebecca stopped, realizing what she'd just admitted. The second night was the worst, 36 hours into the deprogramming. Rebecca's programming reasserted itself with a vengeance. She woke at 3 in the morning screaming that demons were attacking her, that Krishna was testing her faith, that she needed to return to the temple immediately, or her soul would be lost. Joe and Marcus had to physically restrain her to prevent self-harm. She'd started hitting herself, slapping her own face, saying she needed to be punished for doubting, for allowing Maya to confuse her. "This is normal," Joe told Thomas, who'd come running at the screaming. "The programming fights back when it's threatened." "My God," Thomas whispered, watching his daughter thrash against the restraints. "What have they done to her?" "Made her believe she's someone else," Joe said. "Our job is to remind her who she actually is." 2 days into the deprogramming, 48 hours since the extraction, the breakthrough happened at 6:47 in the evening. Jennifer had been showing Rebecca photographs, pictures from before the temple. Rebecca at her high school graduation, Rebecca with friends, Rebecca in her nursing school uniform during her first clinical rotation at the hospital. Rebecca had been looking at the photos with increasing distress. These images of herself didn't match her current identity. The girl in these photos smiled, looked confident, looked like she had a future. "Who is that person?" Jennifer asked, pointing to a photo of Rebecca at 19, laughing with friends at what looked like a birthday party. "That's me," Rebecca whispered. Before what?" "Before I found truth. Or before you were taught to believe something was truth," Jennifer said. "Look at that girl. Does she look like she's suffering? Does she look like she needs to be saved?" Rebecca stared at the photo. Her hands were shaking. "She looks happy," Rebecca admitted. "And do you feel happy now as Radhanatha Devi Dasi?" "I feel—" Rebecca stopped, started crying. "I don't know what I feel anymore." "That's okay," Jennifer said. "Not knowing is the first step to figuring it out." The third day began with Rebecca asking questions instead of defending the temple. 60 hours into the deprogramming. "Do you think I can go back?" Rebecca asked Jennifer. "To nursing school, to my old life?" Jennifer considered the question carefully. "I think you can build a new life," she said. "It won't be exactly like before. You've experienced things, learned things that changed you. But you can decide who you want to be going forward. You don't have to be Radhanatha Devi Dasi. And you don't have to be the Rebecca who existed before the temple. You can be someone new." "What if I can't remember how to be normal?" "What's normal?" Jennifer asked. "There's no script for life. The Krishnas gave you a script, told you exactly what to think, what to say, how to be. Real life doesn't have that. Real life is messy and uncertain, and you have to figure it out as you go." "That sounds terrifying," Rebecca said. "It is," Jennifer agreed, "but it's also freedom." By the fourth day, 96 hours into the deprogramming, Rebecca had stopped identifying as Radhanatha Devi Dasi. She'd started using her birth name again, started eating without guilt, started sleeping more than 4 hours without feeling like she was being lazy, but she was also experiencing what Joe called deprogramming trauma, the realization of what had been done to her, the anger at the temple leadership who'd manipulated her, the grief for 18 months of her life that felt stolen, the shame that she'd fallen for it, that she'd cut off her family, that she'd surrendered everything for an organization that saw her as a revenue source. "I was so stupid," Rebecca said to her father on day 4. Thomas shook his head. "You were searching, you wanted meaning. There's nothing stupid about that." "They exploited it," Rebecca said. "They saw me coming a mile away. Lonely college kid with existential questions. Perfect target." "You're not a target," Thomas said. "You're my daughter, and you're strong enough to survive this." "I don't feel strong," Rebecca whispered. "I feel broken." "Being broken doesn't mean you can't heal," Thomas said. The 5th day brought a setback. 120 hours into the deprogramming, Rebecca woke up chanting, not consciously. She'd been dreaming about the temple, about the devotees, about the sense of purpose and community she'd felt there. And in her half-awake state, muscle memory took over. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. When she realized what she was doing, she started crying again. "It won't leave me alone," she told Jennifer. "The programming. It's in my head and I can't get it out." "It will fade," Jennifer promised. "But it takes time. You spent 18 months building those neural pathways. They won't disappear in 5 days. But every day you're here, every conversation we have, you're building new pathways, stronger ones, based on your actual identity instead of the one they gave you." "What if I want to go back?" Rebecca asked. "What if this is all too hard and I just want to return to the temple where everything was simple?" "You can," Jennifer said. "Nobody here is going to stop you once the 8 days are over. But I want you to really think about whether you want to go back because it's truth or because it's familiar. Because familiar feels safe even when it's actually harmful." The 6th day was when Rebecca Anne Whitmore made the decision that would define the rest of her life. 144 hours into the deprogramming. She was sitting with her mother Patricia, looking through old family photo albums, pictures of Rebecca as a baby, as a toddler, as a child. Pictures of family vacations, birthday parties, Christmases, evidence of a life that had been real, had been happy, before the Krishnas convinced her it was all Maya. "Mom," Rebecca said. "I'm sorry." Patricia looked at her daughter. "Sorry for what?" "For everything. For joining the temple. For cutting you off, for making you worry, for forcing you to kidnap me to get me back." Patricia pulled Rebecca into a hug. "We'd do it again," she said. 1,000 times if we had to. You're our daughter. We weren't going to lose you." But Rebecca had realized something sitting there with the photo albums. The Krishnas hadn't just taken 18 months of her life. They'd taken her ability to believe in her own judgment. Every decision she'd made in the temple had been checked against what the leadership wanted, what the philosophy dictated, what other devotees thought. She'd surrendered her autonomy so completely that now, facing the possibility of freedom, she didn't trust herself to make choices. "How do I know I'm thinking clearly now?" Rebecca asked Jennifer later that day. "How do I know this isn't just a different kind of programming?" "You don't," Jennifer said honestly. "That's the hard part. You have to learn to trust yourself again. But here's the difference. We're not telling you what to think. We're asking you to think, to question, to examine your own beliefs and experiences. The Krishnas told you questioning was doubt, and doubt was spiritual weakness. We're telling you questioning is intelligence and intelligence is strength. The seventh day brought physical recovery, 168 hours into the deprogramming. Rebecca had been eating regular meals, sleeping 8 hours a night, drinking water. Her body was starting to remember what nourishment felt like. The constant headache she'd lived with for 18 months was fading. The brain fog was lifting, and with physical recovery came emotional clarity. "I think I'm angry," Rebecca told Joe Alexander. "That's healthy," Joe said. "At the temple? At myself? At both?" Rebecca paused. "Mostly at the temple. They saw me when I was vulnerable, and they used that. They love-bombed me until I couldn't think straight. They isolated me from everyone who cared about me. They starved me and sleep-deprived me and made me chant until I couldn't tell the difference between spiritual experience and dissociation." Joe nodded. "That's exactly what they did, and recognizing that is the first step to making sure it never happens again." Rebecca looked at him. "Have you ever failed?" Joe asked. "At deprogramming?" Joe's expression darkened. "Yes, more than once." "What happened?" "Some people," Joe said, "the programming goes too deep, or they've been in too long, or they don't have strong enough connections to their previous life to pull them back. And sometimes I just fail. Make the wrong call, push too hard or not hard enough. Those are the ones that haunt me." "What happens to them?" "They go back to the cult," Joe said, "or they end up more traumatized than when we started, or in a few cases, they never really recover. Spend the rest of their lives caught between two identities belonging to neither." Rebecca was quiet. "Am I going to be okay?" she asked. Joe looked at this young woman who'd been through hell and was still asking the hard questions. "Yes," he said, "I think you are. You're asking the right questions. You're angry at the right people. And you've got family who loves you enough to break the law to get you back. That's more than a lot of people have." The 8th day was meant to be the final day of deprogramming, 192 hours since the extraction. But Joe Alexander made a decision that morning that extended the timeline. Rebecca wasn't ready. She was making progress, significant progress, but 8 days wasn't enough to undo 18 months of intensive psychological manipulation. She needed more time, more conversations, more healing. Joe called Thomas and Patricia into the main room, explained the situation. "We need to keep going," Joe said. "Another 3 days minimum, maybe 5. I know that's longer than we planned, and it means more risk of the Krishnas finding us or the police getting involved. But if we send her back into the world now, there's too high a chance she'll relapse." "Whatever it takes," Thomas said immediately. "We're not stopping now." But Rebecca had been listening from the bedroom, walked out and confronted them. "I need to make this decision," she said. "Not you, not Joe, me. I need to decide if I stay or if I leave, because if I don't start making my own choices, I'm just trading one form of control for another." The room went silent. Jennifer smiled slightly. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment when the person being deprogrammed took back their agency. "You're right," Jennifer said. "What do you want to do?" Rebecca thought about it, thought about the temple, about the comfort of certainty, even if that certainty was false. Thought about her family, about the life she'd abandoned, thought about who she'd been and who she'd become and who she wanted to be going forward. "I want to stay," Rebecca said. "Not because you're forcing me, because I'm not done yet. I still have Krishna programming in my head. I still wake up chanting. I still feel guilty about eating. I still think of my family as material attachments. I need more time to work through that. But it has to be my choice. It is your choice," Joe said. "We're here as long as you need us." Over the next 3 days, days 9 through 11, the deprogramming shifted. It was no longer about breaking Rebecca down. It was about building her back up, teaching her critical thinking skills that would help her recognize manipulation in the future, helping her process the trauma of both her time in the temple and the kidnapping itself, preparing her for the moment when she'd have to walk back into the world and figure out who she was going to be. On day 10, 240 hours into the deprogramming, Rebecca asked a question that nobody had expected. "Do you think the Krishnas believe what they're teaching? Or do they know it's manipulation? Jennifer considered carefully. I think some of them genuinely believe, she said. The lower-level devotees, the people like you who joined searching for meaning, they're true believers. But the leadership, the people at the top, I think they know exactly what they're doing. They understand the psychology of control, and they use it deliberately. That makes it worse, Rebecca said. At least if everyone was brainwashed, there'd be no one to blame. But knowing that people at the top are consciously exploiting vulnerable people, Jennifer nodded. That's what makes it a cult instead of just a religion. The intentional manipulation, the systematic exploitation, the lack of informed consent. On day 11, 264 hours since the extraction, Rebecca Anne Whitmore made the decision to leave the cabin. Not because the deprogramming was complete. Joe was clear that full recovery would take months, maybe years, but because she'd reached a point where she could think critically about her experience, could recognize the programming when it arose, and could make conscious choices about who she wanted to be. I think I'm ready, Rebecca told her family and the deprogramming team. Ready to go home. Ready to figure out what comes next. Joe Alexander studied her carefully. Are you going to try to return to the temple? No, Rebecca said firmly. I'm done with the Krishnas. I might explore spirituality again someday, but not like that. Never like that. Good, Joe said, because if you do go back, there's nothing we can do. You're legally an adult. This only worked because you let it work. Remember that. You have the power to choose, always. On August 25, 1978, 11 days after her kidnapping, Rebecca Whitmore left the cabin in the Cascade Mountains and returned to Portland. She looked different than she had on August 14th. Still thin, still with her head shaved, but her eyes were different, clearer, more present, more herself. The first week home was harder than the deprogramming. Rebecca had to face the reality of what she'd lost. Her place in nursing school was gone. She'd have to reapply if they'd even accept her after she'd dropped out. Her savings were gone, donated to the temple. Her friends from before the temple had moved on with their lives and didn't know how to relate to her after what had happened. And worst of all, she had to live with the knowledge that she'd been manipulated, that for 18 months she'd believed something that wasn't true and had surrendered everything for it. Patricia took a leave of absence from teaching to stay home with Rebecca, made sure she ate regular meals, made sure she slept, made sure she had someone to talk to when the Krishna programming reasserted itself, which it did regularly for the first 3 months. Thomas paid for therapy, a psychologist who specialized in cult recovery. It cost money they didn't have, but Thomas didn't care. His daughter was home. That was worth everything. David, who'd just graduated law school, stayed in Portland instead of taking a job in Seattle so he could be close to his sister. Would come over for dinner 3 times a week, would sit with Rebecca and talk about normal things, sports and movies and politics, helping her remember how to have conversations that weren't about scripture or spiritual advancement. 6 months after her deprogramming, Rebecca reapplied to Oregon State's nursing program. Wrote an essay about her experience with the Hare Krishnas that was honest about her vulnerability, her mistakes, and what she'd learned. The admissions committee accepted her for the fall 1979 semester, acknowledging that her experience, while unconventional, had given her insights into manipulation and recovery that would make her a better nurse. 2 years after her deprogramming, Rebecca graduated from nursing school. Started working at Portland General Hospital in the psychiatric unit, specializing in patients experiencing religious delusions and cult-related trauma. She'd found a way to turn her worst experience into something that helped others. 5 years after her deprogramming, Rebecca married a man named Stephen Cole, an engineer she'd met through mutual friends. Stephen knew about her Krishna past. She'd told him on their 3rd date because she'd learned that hiding trauma doesn't make it go away. Stephen had listened, asked thoughtful questions, and told her that who she'd been at 23 didn't define who she was at 28. 10 years after her deprogramming, Rebecca and Stephen had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah and a son named Matthew. Rebecca was fiercely protective of them in ways that her own parents recognized. She monitored what groups they joined, what teachers they trusted, what beliefs they adopted. Not to control them, but to make sure nobody manipulated them the way she'd been manipulated. 20 years after her deprogramming, Rebecca received a phone call from Joe Alexander. He was retiring from deprogramming work, had gotten too old, too slow, and the legal landscape had changed enough that forcible deprogramming was essentially illegal now. But he wanted to check in on the people he'd helped, see how they were doing, make sure the work had been worth it. Rebecca told him she was okay. More than okay. She had a family, a career, a life that felt authentic. Still had moments where the Krishna programming surfaced, usually in times of stress, when her brain wanted the simplicity of certainty over the complexity of freedom. But she'd learned to recognize those moments, sit with them and choose differently. "Did I do the right thing?" Joe asked. "Kidnapping you, holding you against your will." Rebecca thought about that question. The same question she'd been asking herself for 20 years. "I don't know," she said honestly. "You violated my rights, traumatized me in ways I still carry, made choices for me that I should have been allowed to make myself, but you also saved my life. If you hadn't intervened, I'd still be in that temple, or I'd be dead from malnutrition or medical neglect. So was it right? I can't say. But am I grateful? Yes. Complicated gratitude, but gratitude nonetheless." "That's the best answer I could hope for," Joe said. 30 years after her deprogramming, Rebecca was 53 years old, working as a psychiatric nurse practitioner, specializing in cult recovery. She'd written a book about her experience titled 17 Months My Journey Into and Out of the Hare Krishna Movement. The book was used in psychology courses and cult awareness training. Rebecca gave talks at colleges about manipulation techniques, red flags for cult recruitment, and the importance of critical thinking. She'd also become an advocate for changing how society dealt with cult involvement, argued that forcible deprogramming, while sometimes effective, was ethically problematic and should be replaced with better mental health resources, family support systems, and legal protections for people trying to leave high-control groups. Argued that Joe Alexander's methods, while they'd worked on her, were too risky, too traumatic, and too legally questionable to be a sustainable solution. But she also argued that families needed options when someone they loved disappeared into a cult, that the current system, which protected religious freedom at the expense of vulnerable individuals, wasn't working, that there had to be a middle ground between kidnapping and doing nothing. 40 years after her deprogramming, Rebecca attended Joe Alexander's funeral. He died at 87, surrounded by family, his mind still sharp enough to joke about all the cults that probably celebrated his death. The funeral was attended by over 100 people. Most of them were individuals Joe had deprogrammed or family members of those he'd helped. They told stories about the man who'd saved their loved ones, who'd fought against organizations that destroyed lives, who'd operated outside the law because he believed some things were more important than legality. Rebecca spoke at the funeral, talked about Joe as both her rescuer and her kidnapper, as the man who'd given her life back and the man who'd violated her autonomy to do it. As a hero and a criminal, a savior and a traumatizer, a person who'd done terrible things for what he believed were righteous reasons. "The legacy of Joe Alexander is complicated," Rebecca said at the funeral. "He saved hundreds of lives, including mine. But he also operated completely outside legal and ethical boundaries. He believed the ends justified the means, and maybe, in some cases, they did. But that doesn't mean his methods should be celebrated or repeated. It means we need to build better systems, systems that protect vulnerable people without violating their rights, systems that give families options without requiring them to break the law, systems that recognize cult involvement as a mental health crisis, not a religious choice." As Rebecca stood at Joe Alexander's funeral 40 years after he'd kidnapped her from a Portland street corner, she thought about the question that had defined her adult life. Was he right to do what he did? She still didn't have a clear answer. Yes, because she was alive and free and had built a meaningful life. No, because the trauma of being kidnapped and held against her will had shaped her in ways that were still difficult. Yes, because the Hare Krishnas had been destroying her and her family had been helpless. No, because violating someone's autonomy, even to save them, sets a dangerous precedent. The truth was more complicated than either narrative could capture. Joe Alexander, had saved Rebecca Whitmore's life. He'd also traumatized her. He'd given her family back their daughter. He'd also violated her civil liberties. He'd fought against an organization that exploited vulnerable people. He'd also used methods that were themselves exploitative. Rebecca had spent 40 years living in that complexity, had learned that sometimes there are no good choices, only less bad ones. That sometimes people do terrible things for good reasons. That sometimes the person who saves you is also the person who hurts you. And that gratitude and anger can coexist, that you can be grateful someone intervened while also wishing they'd done it differently. The question that Joe Alexander's life raises isn't just about him, it's about all of us. About the systems that fail vulnerable people so completely that desperate families feel they have no choice except to hire someone who will kidnap their own children. About the balance between religious freedom and protection from manipulation. About the point where rescue becomes violation. About who gets to decide what's a dangerous cult versus an alternative religion. About the cost we're willing to pay when we try to save people from themselves. Joe Alexander didn't have answers to these questions. He just had a technique that worked often enough to justify continuing, and a belief that saving people from mind control was worth any price, including his own freedom and reputation. Was he right? The families who got their loved ones back say yes, absolutely, without question. The civil libertarians who watched him operate say no, that violating rights to save people from violating their own rights is a paradox that can't be justified. The people who went through his deprogrammings give answers that span the entire spectrum from "he saved my life" to "he traumatized me permanently." Rebecca Anne Whitmore's answer, 40 years later, was both. He saved me and he hurt me. He gave me my life back, and he violated my autonomy. He was a hero and he was a criminal. And the fact that all of those things can be true simultaneously is what makes his legacy so complicated, so uncomfortable, and so important to examine. If this story made you think about freedom, family, and the price we pay when we try to save people from themselves, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to Cult Exit for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about mind control, deprogramming, and the thin line between rescue and kidnapping. Comment below. Was Joe Alexander a hero or a criminal? Where do you draw the line between saving someone and violating their rights? Because these stories aren't just history. Right now, somewhere, another family is facing the same impossible choice the Whitmore family faced in 1978, and they're wondering if there's anyone left who's willing to fight the way Joe Alexander did. Until next time, remember, the people we call heroes aren't always the people who follow the rules. Sometimes they're the people who break every rule because they believe something is more important than the law, and sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes, like Joe Alexander, they're both.